In traditional sculpting, oftentimes a sculptor would start in clay. This is a monster clay hard, sculpted onto an armature that allows me to remove the parts here. Now, the refining step would be to cast to create a mold of your clay sculpt and cast a wax copy. That wax copy would then is where all the final details would be applied. That just can't be captured in clay itself. Because of the armature and how the molds are designed, I can transfer the articulation points from the clay sculpt into the wax casts. That allows me to continue sculpting with articulation in mind. So now I'm going to show you the wax casting process. I've already made the molds, and so I'm going to be preparing the molds and injecting the wax into the molds, and then we'll demold those wax copies. Now, some of the steps I'm going to be doing are what would have been done in the past when these action figures were made in wax and not 3D sculpted. But in particular, I'm going to be showing a step that allows me to hollow the inside of the torso so that I can put in my own T-pegs into the torso and sandwich them together. Now, for my molds for wax casting, I've made them out of plaster. In part, it's a efficiency of materials and cost. You can get regular plaster of Paris rather cheaply compared to silicone. The lifespan of these molds is significantly reduced because of the nature of the preparation and casting. It's just going to degrade sooner than a silicone mold would. However, keeping these molds around for a long time isn't my objective. My objective is to get a handful of wax casts that I can use to do my refining sculpts. Now, because they're plaster, wax has a tendency and can bond, depending on the wax ingredients, can bond to the plaster if the plaster is dried out, or I think if it's too warm relative to room temperature, I guess, or relative to the wax temperature. And so I'm going to be dunking these in cold water for a few minutes, let them soak up the water, take them out and dry them before I cast. Now I've got 4 molds. Yeah, 4 molds. One for the pair of arms, one for the pair of legs, one for each half of the torso, I guess that'll be 5, and one for the head. Now over here I have my wax melting in an electric pot. This is a basic Presto pot. Runs about $35 on Amazon. And inside, instead of melting the wax in the full base, for size comparison there, it's maybe about 10 inches wide in diameter. I'm keeping these stainless steel bowls with the wax melting there. That allows me to, one, ensure that the depth of the wax is deep enough when I'm drawing the wax into a syringe that I'm not sucking a lot of air. If it were more distributed across a wider base, it would get thin pretty quick, and I'd risk bringing air into the syringe, which can cool it but also introduce bubbles. And so the ingredients of the wax can actually thin out, or rather separate, and so occasional stirring keeps things distributed. The amount of separation that can occur depends on the ingredients. A later video on the various ingredients and what we think they do. All right, so I have that cooling, or rather staying warm at around maybe 170, 180 degrees Fahrenheit. All right, so now I'm going to be taking these out. They've just soaked for probably about 3 minutes or so. They don't really need to be super soaked. I found earlier that soaking them too often started to degrade the surface of the plaster more than I was expecting. So I'm going to leave them in a little shorter. Take them out. And for drying, just need to kind of blot them with some paper towels. Okay, so preparing the molds for wax casting means that, one, they are now cool and a little moist, but also that I put in the articulation fixtures that are going to allow the wax cast to articulate just like the clay sculpt here. And so if we see how I have constructed this, there's an internal armature that has these holes inside, and then these pegs. These pegs are anchored to a disc with an armature wire inside. Because the wax is as hard as it is, I don't need to be concerned about armature wire being inside. Now, as often as I find the wax breaks after I've cast it, it's easy to repair and still doesn't make having an armature, or rather having an armature inside it, wouldn't make that much of a difference. So the purpose, again, of casting in wax is to refine the surface, add those details that you just can't get in wax. In this case, I'm just doing a generic body, and I'm going to do all of the details in wax. But I want to, most importantly, transfer the articulation of the clay sculpt into the wax cast. So to do that, I need to take, these are polystyrene dowels that I'm going to set into the mold, and then the wax is cast around it. So first, for this head, set that piece inside, gently close it up. Now, wax cools very quickly, so I don't need to be too concerned about how tight these molds are, and especially because cleaning up is going to be pretty easy as well. The next, I'll do the legs. Let's get you a better view here. And so for the legs, I'm going to set these dowels in there. And you can see how I vented these. They're going to come down to the inside of the thigh, fill, and then rise, and then push the air out the top. Next, I'm going to do the arms, and you'll notice that in these hands I have a metal dowel, and that's to serve as a placeholder for the grip that I'll eventually sculpt a hand around. So when I come to the mold, I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to set these dowels into the mold. Set the shoulder dowels into the mold here and gently close it. Now, I need to be gentle because these dowels can shift, and if they shift in the mold, then the wax is going to get cast around them. And so I'm just going to be very, very gentle. Make sure everything stays in place. All right, I think I did it. Take a peek down the hole there, and should be good. All right, next, the torso. Now, the way I've designed this torso mold is I basically I did a mold of the solid of the full torso, and then I did it right along the center of the torso. Use this as an example here. Right down the center, you can see the green clay parting line there. By making the parting line right down the center, I know that when I make the mold of it, each of these halves are going to represent a near perfect, hopefully, half of the torso. And then I open it up, fill the inside with clay and the armature fixtures that I'm going to show in just a moment, and then pour another plaster cap on top. So those articulation fixtures, you can see the shape of here. Basically create the inner cavities that I can eventually put a T-peg into. Now, the diameter of these fixtures here are the same diameter as the pegs that go into the arm, so that I know when I'm ready to, while I'm sculpting and I want to test the rotation of the arm, I'll know that the peg is going to fit nicely in the holes of the torso. And then a post for the head. So I'm going to do the same thing down here. Make sure everything's seated well. And then close it up. Okay, so we'll line these pieces up here. As I'm casting, I need to work pretty quickly. I'm going to be casting with a 60 milliliter syringe. A couple of benefits of a wider syringe, pretty big diameter here. I'd say it's about maybe 1.25 inches diameter, is that the wax, I believe, will stay hotter longer when there's more volume. If it were narrower, there's less volume inside, and that means a relatively larger proportion to the outside of the syringe, where the wax will start to cool along the walls. I'm also casting and injecting through a lure lock tip here. Originally, they're quite narrow. It might be like a 14 gauge. So I trimmed the syringe higher up and at an angle like that, which helps insertion into the mold, but also gives me a wider diameter to push the wax through. Yeah, so next steps, let's cast. So the sequence of casting, depending on how quickly the wax will cool in the syringe, it's important to think about the different molds you have and how successful they'll be at filling quickly as the wax is cooling over time, and as it cools, it's going to get a little thicker, and the viscosity is going to increase. Now, depending on, I'd say that's not really a problem for how small these are. I'm going to be going pretty quickly, but with larger molds or more molds, the temperature of the wax is something to consider. And so you can be strategic in which molds you fill first, knowing that you might need more or lower viscosity, higher temperature wax going into thinner molds where you need that wax to flow more quickly, versus larger volumes or more simple mold designs where the wax could be slightly more viscous and still flow cleanly. So I'm going to go draw wax. Probably going to get maybe about 40 milliliters here, and then go for it. And lastly, I'm going to squirt out any remaining from the syringe so that I can easily reuse it. The lower locks, on the other hand, are single use, so something to think about. Yeah, before it all cools, you want to make sure you fully detach and separate your syringe, clean the surfaces, and then I just let whatever's left inside, I just let that chill and scrape it out before the next one. All right, and now, I mean, you can see I've just rotated the camera to the other side. It's been maybe 15 seconds, and already this wax is pretty solidified. This should cool pretty quickly, especially the stuff inside, since the mold was cooled down. It had a moist surface to it, and so demolding these things can really happen within a couple of minutes. I'll take a look first at the head mold here, and quick separation there. Yeah, that's great. It's already hard. You can see I can go ahead and scrape into this. And popping these out, pretty simple too. Again, this is a very simple design to this figure, so I'm not stressing about pulling these out without any issues. I'm going to start to separate my parts because I'm planning to do 4 copies of this. I can also reuse this wax. It's not wasted. can go right back into the pot. Now, if it picks up a little too much plaster dust on it, I'll just discard it, but a little won't hurt. So gently rock this back and forth. Get that clean separation. Look at that. So that wax came down the side here, filled those toes nicely, and then up to the top. Break off the mushroom top there. And slowly rock these out. Oh, there we go. Brilliant. Now, it may look pretty scrappy there, but that can all get cleaned up with relative ease. Brilliant. Oh, look at that. Oh, so clean. Perfect. See what we did here. Great. I'm going to take this whole piece out. Now, the trick I found here was I need to rotate, and instead of trying to take the whole line out, because this is relatively thin, it can snap easily, I'm going to rotate that dowel out like this. Pull it out. Now I can pull out these spacers. Relative ease. A little help. Look at that. So clean. And what I do to get this ready to apply to the next, to the other half, is I sand it down so everything's nice and flush. Great. And while I'm at it, I'm also going to set these back up. Sure to blow out any wax dust that gets in there. Now, instead of full dunking, what I'm going to do is I'm going to just blot the inside of the torso here with a wet cloth. Keep it moist. My impression is that the temperature of the wax kind of like dries it out. Does something. But I just want to keep it cool for the next run. Sometimes the wax that comes over the top can kind of grip to the mold, which makes it hard to demold the whole thing. So, oh, perfect, perfect, perfect. Look at that. Again, we'll rotate these pieces out. All right. Again, nice clean surfaces there. I'm not concerned with these stripes in the wax surface there. I can just burnish that out. I'm going to be applying new wax on top of this anyways. But you can actually see that stream right down the center there, that kind of vein. I believe that's the first kind of like shot of the wax going down, and then it rises back up. So I got my wax parts. I'm going to clean all that up later. And that's it. I'm gonna put in the fixtures in this a little later, but that's the end-to-end process. So again, I'm preparing the molds for wax casting. It consists of wetting the plaster molds. In this case, I'm using plaster. If you're using silicone, I think dunking it in water just to cool it down after each cast would be sufficient, and then blotting out the water. So doing a similar thing to what I've done here with plaster. Inlaying the fixtures, the articulation fixtures. Again, that's important to carry through the articulation. That's a part of the clay sculpt into your wax cast. It also helps set up, for your production casting after you make your silicone molds of your wax cast, to have all that articulation fixture in place. So when you're making your mold, you're not having to add it after you cast your resin. And yeah, keeping the wax warm in a Presto pot here, keeping it around 170, 180 degrees. Sometimes I'll shoot it a little higher, a little hotter. But using a big syringe, you can easily reuse these things. You'll need to use a new lure lock each time. And then casting, making sure you don't burn your fingers. And then demolding and being really gentle with it, because the wax will break if you handle it roughly. So anyways, happy casting to everyone. And if you have questions about wax casting, see the links in our channel about section. You can find myself, Kerfloss, and Death and Strawberries on Instagram, and see all of our other work there.